This week, a strange but really wonderful Sunday school story, the sequel to last week's ugly tale of deception and deceit. This week, we get a wonderful story of reconciliation and forgiveness, with Jacob and Esau making peace with one another. So, 20 years pass in the time since we last saw Jacob. He has not completely always mended his ways. He had some issues with his uncle Laban. He has a process. It takes him a lot of years. In fact, I would argue Jacob doesn't really get it until he's an old man in Egypt. But unfortunately, we don't have that story. We don't have time to really dig into the full scope of Jacob's life. But this will be sufficient, this story this week, to continue to explore what it means that Jacob is chosen and beloved by God and what that means for us. So, the 20 years have seen Jacob build a great deal of wealth and have a sizable family. Now, the family dynamics are a bit odd, to say the least, especially to our sensibilities. Four wives, essentially. I mean, two wives, two concubines. Yeah, what a kind of messed up situation, and this will result in some heartache. It already has at this point in the story. The sisters, Jacob's married to two sisters, Rachel and Leah, and they have this rivalry. So that this is never God's intention for a guy to have four women at the same time. But it is what it is. That's a sinful world, and like I said, Jacob he doesn't totally grasp things at this time, and it is part of the accepted uh, practice of the day. Not that that makes it right, but Jacob ends up with a large family, and God, what he does. I mean, we all have messed up families. We've all made bad decisions in our families, and what God does. He looks at your family as it is right now, whatever it is. Many blended families out there. He looks at your family and says, "I'm going to bless your family as it is right now. We don't need to worry about whatever sins occurred in the past. I'm just going to work with what I got," says God. And so he blesses this family as it is. Again, and Jacob is blessed. There's a reason he's wealthy. His uncle tried to keep him from being wealthy, but God saw fit to give Jacob a lot of wealth. But in this kind of, if you saw Wednesday night sermon, talked about Howard Hughes a little bit on Wednesday night. Jacob's wealth doesn't give him fulfillment or happiness. In fact, he's still very much prone to anxiety and worry. If you've ever had a night where you couldn't sleep because of anxiety, you've got something in common with Jacob here. As he wanders around, he doesn't even try to sleep. He knows he's got a big meeting the next day with Esau. Last he heard, Esau wanted to kill him. As far as he knows, nothing has changed. So he sends his family off, and he is all by himself until he gets attacked by a stranger in the middle of the night. Is it Esau attacking him? No. Who is it? Who is this mysterious stranger? Jacob perhaps didn't know who it was at first. As time went on, he did come to a realization of who he was fighting with, who he was wrestling with. He was wrestling with God himself. Uh, a manifestation of God in the form of an angel. Many believe this is the second person of the Trinity. This is the one who would come to be known as Jesus one day, who would be descended from Jacob, who now is wrestling against Jacob. This is a very comforting in the end and helpful story for us. And it tells us what to do when we are wrestling with God. And don't tell me you've never wrestled with God in terms of your life circumstances. When we acknowledge a sovereign God, in other words, a God who has all the power and all the ability to do anything or prevent anything from happening, I mean, this is what we believe. God is all powerful. And so when we have to reconcile that with the things in our life, when we say, God, how could you ever let this happen to me? That's wrestling with God. Or on maybe a less dramatic level, if you're reading the Bible and trying to figure out what in the world it means. In a story, you can wrestle with the story, right? What is this all about here? That's wrestling with God. Jacob shows us how to wrestle with God. He doesn't give up. He keeps wrestling with God. Even if God kind of playfully says, all right, game's over, now let me go. Jacob flat out refuses to let God go. I'm not going to let you go until you do something for me, until you give me a blessing. Then I'll let you go. And Jacob gets the blessing. Talk about, the Jews have this word chutzpah, which means like this shameless audacity, asking for things that are a little bit beyond the pale of what you would expect someone to feel entitled to ask for. Does Jacob have a right to demand a blessing of God? Come on now. But here's the fun answer to that question. Yes, Jacob does have a right to demand a blessing of God. Well, wait a minute. From what we've read about Jacob so far, he's not exactly a righteous person. Certainly, Jacob is a horrible sinner, liar, cheater, thief. But it's not on the basis of his actions that he has a right to demand a blessing of God. None of us, on the basis of our actions and our morality and our own personal righteousness, have a right to demand anything of God. However, if somebody makes a promise to you, you have every right to hold them to that promise. Now, in a sinful world, unfortunately, people will renege on their promises, but you got a right to call them out on that. You can say, and you might want to be smart about the circumstances for the sake of relationships you may not want to pursue. But when someone makes a promise to you, you have a right to say, okay, I expect you to be faithful to your word. Again, sinners renege on their promises, but God is bound because He's not a sinner. So when God says, I'm going to do something, He has to do it. Luther said, if I woke up in hell, I would demand to get out of there. Not on the basis that we don't deserve hell, but on the basis that for the sake of Christ, we've been promised not to go to hell, promised salvation. And so Jacob has been promised. You can go back and read in the Genesis account of the night in Bethel, the house of God, as Jacob uses the stone for the pillow. He sees the vision of the angels ascending and descending from heaven, and God makes promises to him. So Jacob is simply asking 20 years later for God to affirm the promises he has made. Now, notable, safety from Esau, not necessarily one of those promises. Presence of God is the promise. And this is helpful for us when we are wrestling with God, when we think about the things we're suffering. God didn't necessarily promise us not to suffer. There's a lot that God didn't guarantee. But there are some things God did guarantee. He guaranteed His eternal presence with us. He guaranteed His love for us. He guaranteed forgiveness for us through Christ. And these are things we can ask Him for and even demand from Him with the assurance that He will give us these things. So Jacob, and the other neat thing about wrestling is Jacob wrestles with God. How close is God? I mean, what's the difference between wrestling and hugging? It's hard if you just take a snapshot. It's all the same. You might be feeling adversarial, but you're also pretty close, right? And so this is helpful too. The problem if you're having a faith crisis is if you separate from God. If you say, no thanks, I don't want anything to do with you. That's the problem. Wrestling with God, talking to Him, telling Him how you feel, that's never a problem. Even if you're mad at God. And I think we should all strive to a point where we're not mad with God. But if you are, that's faith. Because at least if you believe in the God you're mad at, right? And you believe that it's worth telling Him how you're feeling. So Jacob is faithful, even if he's a horrible sinner. He still has faith, and so he's wrestling with God. He refuses to let God go. This is the advice for us as well. When you're reading the Bible and something doesn't make sense, don't let it go until you get a blessing, until you find the good news in that passage that God has for you, whatever it may be. So the result of Jacob's wrestling is he gets a new name. We talked about last week his name being Cheater. Now he has a new name. His name is Israel, which means one who strives with God and wins. Uh, Ultimately, Jesus is the one who overcomes for us. And so the Jesus becomes Israel reduced to one man. He struggles with the Father. He loses the wrestling match at the cross, but he keeps his faith even as he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is still faith that the Son has in the Father's plans. Remember what I said, as long as you're talking to God, that's what matters. Jesus is talking to his Father with his dying breath, and then Jesus is raised from the dead. Jesus overcomes. And Jesus shows us the reconciliation that is possible then as Jacob and Esau end this little chapter on a very happy note with reconciliation. It starts with Jacob being reconciled to God. Esau, God knows what he's doing. Esau was all bent out of shape because Jacob stole from him. God gives Esau in abundance. So don't feel too bad for Esau. Yeah, he didn't get the blessing and the promise, but in terms of his life experience, he ended up pretty well off, and that's what in fact he says to Jacob. Jacob tries to give him all these gifts to make up for his sin, and Esau's like, "It's okay, bro. I'm good. God has been really good to me. I'm a rich man. I don't need any more. I don't need anything from you. We can be buds again." Now they do go their separate ways. They don't live in the same land. Their people probably would be prone to fight with one another, just as Abraham and Lot's people were all those years ago. But they do at least part on good terms. And this brings us to the truth of reconciliation and the wonderful ways that Christians can set aside even homicidal impulses, as Esau had, in order to be reconciled and to love our brothers again. So, what does the story tell us about God and his tender mercies? Again, it shows us his love for sinners. It doesn't show us that we will never get adversity from God. He might attack us in the middle of the night, but even when he does so, it will be to bring us to a deeper and greater faith, to remind us of the promises he made to us, to allow us to cling and call upon those promises. God is one who sometimes is hard to figure out. He's God, we're not. We don't always understand his ways, but his ways do reveal to us that he wants to hold us close and he wants to bless us. What does the story tell us about who we are as God's people? We are given a new name. We've been renamed in baptism as children of God. And, well, how do we now live out that identity as God's people? Well, a couple of ways. One, by remembering God's promises, even calling out his promises, reminding him of the forgiveness and eternal life he promised to us. And then the spirit of reconciliation with one another, to follow the example of Jacob and Esau here, to forgive, to not hold grudges, to love one another even when people have wronged us. This is very much the immediate life application of this story. And again, keep wrestling with God, but don't let him go until you get your blessing. God bless you as you wrestle with your lessons this week.